Great for just about any kind of picture frame. But if you're trying to do something like a box with mitered corners, you're not going to be able to do a beveled edge that long. So I made this bevel cutting sled, which allows me to cut long bevels with the blade at 45 degrees, which is what you'd want to do if you're making a box with mitered corners. I'll use this ultra-high molecular weight polyethylene for the runner. It's a single runner sled, so it's important that the runner fit tightly in the slot. This is a pre-cut runner that I bought, and you can see it's loose. So what I did is I bought a sheet of polyethylene and I ripped it on the table saw so that it fits. See how tightly that fits? But once it's in, it moves. It has no play at all. The key to ripping these to the precise width is to have the fence set to the precise distance from the blade. I'll put a link below to another video that shows how to micro adjust the fence to get it just right. Underneath, I've slipped in a piece of cardboard in order to raise this up just slightly above the table. I'm running a thin bead of super glue along here. I don't want a lot because I don't want it to squeeze out onto the table. And then using the fence as a guide to keep everything reasonably square, I drop that down on there. I can keep pushing with my hands or drop this big weight on here till it dries. I put these screws in from the top rather than from the bottom because I can get a better grip on the polyethylene than on the MDF. And I've used M5 metric bolts and tapped into the polyethylene. You could use wood screws, that'd be fine too. The super glue is important in order to keep that runner straight while you're drilling and putting in the screws, because any waviness in it, then it'll be too tight. And now is the time to check whether it does move smoothly. With the blade at 45 degrees and using the runner as the guide rather than the fence. Straight edge on here, putting a square against that. This is a sacrificial fence. It's going to get cut off, so it doesn't actually have to be perfectly square. It's just more convenient if it is. The thing that is important about this fence is that it be square to the table and flat. I've screwed on the back fence. The front fence I've got clamped to the sacrificial fence and spaced out with a couple of plastic cards of about the same thickness. So then what I'll do is the 5-cut method, which is I make a first cut, put that cut edge against the fence, another cut, a third cut, a fourth cut, and with the 5th cut, I'm back to the original edge. I make that wider, that takes off a strip, and if the fence was perpendicular to the blade, that strip would have the same width. The reason for the 4 cuts preceding that is to multiply the error, so that it's easier to measure the error of that strip. With the blade at 90 degrees, as you'd have on a normal crosscut sled, it doesn't really matter if the board doesn't sit perfectly flat on the base, because the cut is at 90 degrees to the board. But with a bevel cut, if one edge of the board is slightly lifted up, it would be reaching a different point on the blade, which would be a different distance. So it's important on a bevel cut that the material be secured to the base, and that's where these clamps come in. I'm focusing the clamping on this edge of the board because it doesn't really matter if this side lifted up a little bit. And I'll put a mark here so that I don't lose track of how many times I've spun the board around. I'll mark the ends of this so that I can remember the orientation, because that's important. Measuring the width of this cut-off piece is difficult because this edge is not lined up with that edge. So the method I'm using is to place the cut-off strip between these 1, 2, 3 blocks on a flat surface, then move in the calipers, and I've got them lifted up so that this piece rests parallel with the block, not on an angle. Then move this into point where I don't hit a hole, and I get a dimension, and I don't really care that it's offset by this because I'm going to subtract this dimension from the other dimension. So I'm getting 92.55 or 92.56 each time I try it. I'll write that right on here, and that is in millimeters. On the other end, I'm getting 92.40, kind of an average reading. And now I'll calculate the amount by which one end of the fence would have to be shimmed in order to make it perfect. So first step is to take the difference between these two numbers, 92.55 minus 92.40. This is in millimeters. What does this 0.15 millimeter error mean? Well, first of all, it's an error that's 4 times greater than the error if I just did a single cut, because we rotated that blank 4 times to multiply the error. So in a single cut it would be 1/4 of this, which would be about 0.04 millimeter. Which means if I was using the sled to cut a bevel on this piece of wood, it would end up out of square by 0.04 millimeter. This cheap lined paper is 0.08 millimeter. So the error would be half the thickness of this thin piece of paper, and you would never be able to see that. Just for fun, see if we can do better. And there's another reason I want to show how to do better. You may have a greater error on the first time you go around, and so then you'll need to know what do you do to get it reasonably good. Then, as I mentioned before, this error is 4 times greater than the actual error if you had just made a straight cut, so I have to divide that by 4. The distance along here from where I was measuring is not the length of the stick, but somewhat less. Where I was measuring on those blocks is about 10 inches. So I'm going to spread that error over the 10 inches to get the error per inch by dividing by 10. So that number is the error per inch along this edge, which would be the same as the error per inch along this edge. So if I want to get the amount that I would have to adjust the shim, I got to multiply by the length of this edge. That's about 20 inches from the pivot point to the pivot point. So I'll multiply that by 20. And that tells me I would have to adjust one of those shims by 0.075 millimeter. Binder paper is 0.08. I wanted 0.075, so I'm going to call that. As A is larger than B, I would have to tip I'm exaggerating, I'd have to tip the board this way to reduce A. To shift the board this way, I have to increase the size of this shim. So there's my shim. I've got a fresh blank. I've got my little paper shim in there. So I'll do another 5-cut test and see if we've made things better, worse, or indifferent. So I'm getting 92.6 at the A end and 92.63 at the B end. So here's my first attempt. This is the second attempt with the extra paper shim in, and the difference is 0.03 millimeters, whereas here before the difference was 0.15, so that is a big improvement. And if I divide that by 4, divide by the 10 inches, multiply by the 20-inch length of the fence, I get 0.015 millimeters. So like 1/100th of a millimeter error. With the shims and clamps in place and not changed, I'm screwing in from the bottom. These clamps are holding the fence against the base so that there isn't any base moving away from the fence as the screw goes in, and then it may be settling down in a slightly different position. With the fence all screwed in from the bottom, can remove the clamps and the shims. And now the sacrificial fence has no purpose, so I'll cut it off. I'll mention this notch here is not there for any reason. This was just a scrap of wood that I had and happened to have that notch in it. I don't want the sled teetering on the runner, so I've slipped boards underneath on each end. Now I'll use the sled to check that the blade is actually at 45 degrees by cutting a piece of wood at 45 with it resting firmly on the base. When I set the blade to 45 degrees, I just come in easy to the stop rather than jamming it hard, because that would distort the whole carriage and put the blade out of alignment temporarily. So just easy like that. Now I'll take this piece that I just cut off and I'll cut it again on the same side. So I think you can see where this is going, that if the blade wasn't 45, then we'll be able to reveal the error. And then you can place them on your best square and see where they join up in the corner. Here they're not joining perfectly. See, I adjusted the tilt limit on the table saw, so now I'll recut both of these edges and see if that brings it into square. Definitely better, just a very slight. So I might try that once more, just a little more turn of that stop screw on the tilt mechanism. And on this try, I think I got it bang on. These fences are 2 inches thick. The reason I made them so thick was to give some leverage when you're clamping, the fulcrum and the 2 points. And this front fence, there's a bevel along that edge so that when something's up against it, a little bit of sawdust doesn't throw you off. These spacer blocks are a different dimension on each side, and so that's handy to be able to clamp different thicknesses of wood, and I can just flip it around to a different side. And I made a couple of them. So the T-slot has another purpose, and that's for the adjustable stops. So the way this would work is, if I'm making a box, I'd cut first a 45 degree, then I'd flip that around the long side, or I could cut the short side. And then I can get the next piece and, repeat and do the same thing. So the stops allow you to create sides and ends that are the exact same length, which is important to get a well-constructed box. The height of the fence was chosen so that these stop blocks could swing close to the bottom for thin pieces of wood without hitting the bottom. So choose your stop blocks before you design the fence. I made the rails out of poplar wood because it's lightweight, low cost, and has straight grain without knots. Another handy accessory is this clip-on in-feed support, so that when you pull the sled back it doesn't tip off and fall on the floor. I'll put a link below the video showing how to make one of these. Mark the outside of the box so that I don't get the pieces mixed up, and then also I can line up the corners so that they match to keep the grain together. I'll cut the board in half just to make the pieces more manageable. I've got the edge well clamped here, and because I've got a lot hanging off, I've got another clamp down here so it doesn't sort of tip up. I used an 80 tooth crosscut blade, which gave a nice finish on the good edge, and a bit of burning on the waste edge, which I don't really care about. And every cut has to be made with the outside of the box facing up, which is indicated by these pencil lines. So this is the waste piece that was over here before, and I'll now cut that off so that the bevel is going the right way. With the board still clamped in position from the cut that was just made, I'll measure to get the outside dimension of the box and set the stop to that dimension. And now I can flip the board around, bring it into the stop, and know that I've got the correct dimension. This piece that just got cut off, it matches the grain there, so that'll get flipped around and I'll cut that off. And once again, with the piece still clamped in place from the cut that was just made, I'll set the other stop to the short dimension of the box, then flip the piece around, lower the stop, run it in, and then that'll give me the correct dimension there. So now from this other piece, these pencil lines match up, and since this is long, this will have to be a short piece. And then this will become a long piece. The first cut on each piece is always with the stops up. If I was making a bunch of boxes of all the same dimension, it's very convenient because I just leave these stops fixed in their place and I could keep going back and forth from long side to short side. I had planned to cut the dados for the box bottom and top before I cut it into pieces, but that's okay, I can still do each piece individually now. Just running 180 grit sandpaper along these sharp edges so that the bottom and top don't get hung up. I've got all the pieces lined up by the pencil lines. I've got them pushed against a straight edge, and then I'll join them together with this red construction tape, which I like because it's got a really strong bond, but it doesn't leave any residue. Flip it over. I want to know that the box top and bottom are going to fit before I apply the glue, and then find they don't. So I'm checking that all the corners are closing tightly. And I'll just do a check to make sure it's square, and it is. If it wasn't, I could maybe do a little push to get it square. So I won't clamp that. The tape is sufficient. So there's a good clean corner. I'll use this cradle to run the box over the dado blade to cut the slots. And I want the depth of the cut to be just slightly less so it doesn't come through into the inside of the box. So I made this test piece out of the scraps, and I'll set that in there and adjust the blade height until I get it just right. So there's my test slot. Looks like it's almost coming through, but you can see that it isn't. So I'll go with that height. I'll show at the end of the video how to make this. It's pretty simple, but there's a couple of tricks. So there I cut 8 slots without changing the fence by rotating the box around. And one thing I want to point out, well, first of all, you want the box registered against this edge for consistency. And then also you want it registered against here, because this is the thing that is going to catch the exit of the blade. The exit of the blade down here, and so that avoids excessive tear out. So the thing I like about this particular way of cutting the splines is I can use the ruler on the table saw to set the spacing. And I want the spacing in this case to be 1/2 inch. The first one was cut at 1 1/16 inch. So I'll move over 1/2 inch to 1 1/2 and 1/16. So I can cut another 8 slots with the fence in this position, then move another 1/2 inch and cut the next 8 until I'm finished. So that gave an even spacing, and the other way would have been marking with a ruler and pencil and lining up the dado each time, which I've always found I end up getting one of them off a little bit, and it's very noticeable to the eye. You can see down here how the cradle gets consumed. So if I was doing a different box with a different pitch, I'd want to make a new cradle. What I can do is flip this around and use the other side. So I get to kind of use the cradle twice. If I'm making a bunch of boxes the same, I would do all the first slots on all the boxes, then all the second slots, and so on. The more of this that I can trim off by machine, the less I need to trim off by hand. This last bit can either be sanded off or with a hand plane. Advantage of the hand plane is it doesn't end up with an uneven surface from sanding. I slipped this 1/8 inch hardboard into the 1/8 inch kerf so that the pieces aren't flopping around as the box gets cut in half. On the bottom half, I cut in here with a ball bearing router bit on the table, and on the top I cut in on the inside. This little bit in the corners I'll chisel out. With those corners chiseled out, let's see how it fits. Nice. There it is with an oil finish, and I've drilled a couple of finger holes here to make it easier to open. And this is the new home for the Blum jigs so that they don't get lost between projects. I use the same trick with the tape on the corner to hold that together. I've got a 90-degree brace in here while the glue dries in the miter corner. But I've slipped a little credit card in here so that I'm going to get slightly greater than 90 degrees. And that's so that when a box drops into the jig, if the corner of the box isn't exactly 90 degrees, the jig won't prevent it from bottoming out down here. Now this thing that was glued together is clamped between two sliding boards. And I've got a 45-degree triangle clamped on there so that I get this at the right angle. And I've got it all resting on the flat surface of the table saw and pushed down before I put the clamps on. You can probably see it's just made with scraps of wood of arbitrary lengths, whatever I had laying around, because this is kind of a semi-disposable jig. After it's used a few times, it gets tossed out. The next time I make one of these, I think I'll cut a bevel on the inside edge of this piece that goes in the middle before I glue it together, and then I won't be concerned about any dust or glue being in there that prevents the box from sitting down tight in the jig.